So how do you write good prompts? How do you create good ChatGPT prompts? Well, in the end, every good prompt consists of two main elements. And that would be the goal of your prompt and some additional context, some additional information that helps ChatGPT produce a better result, better output for the prompt you specified, for the goal you specified with your prompt. Though this context part could actually be broken up into two separate types of context, two separate types of extra information. Because it is quite common that for many prompts, you add a role to the prompt. So where you assign a role to ChatGPT, so that it's not just the default AI assistant anymore, but that it's instead something more specific, defined by you. For example, if we want ChatGPT to create a highly engaging tweet, which we can post on Twitter, we could specify a goal that could be write a tweet about hiking, but we could also specify an extra role, typically before specifying the goal. And in that extra role, you can tell ChatGPT how it should behave, hence giving ChatGPT extra context, which it will use for generating the result, the output. Now, adding such a role to your prompt is totally optional and definitely not needed for all prompts. Indeed, there are many kinds of prompts where adding such a role simply isn't needed or doesn't make sense. For example, if you're asking ChatGPT who the 16th president of the United States was, you don't need to add an extra role. The question alone is enough. But for some prompts, like this one here, adding such an extra role can make a lot of sense. Now, besides adding such an optional role, you can also add extra constraints or extra information to your prompt. And this is also optional, but highly recommended, since adding such extra constraints and extra information makes almost all prompts better, and therefore also makes almost all responses better. And in the end, both roles and extra information or constraints are, of course, all about adding that extra context, which I mentioned before. For example, here I added a constraint that the response, the output generated by ChatGPT, should contain no more than 2 emojis at most, and that the target audience are nature enthusiasts. In addition, I added some extra information here where I tell ChatGPT that the tweet it generates should highlight 2 advantages of going on a hike regularly. As a result here, I get this tweet about the advantages of going on a hike regularly, which only uses 2 emojis as instructed by me, and which clearly targets nature enthusiasts. And that's of course just a basic example. Throughout the course and throughout this section you will see way more examples, but the general idea is always the same. With every prompt you have a goal, and pretty much all prompts get better when you add extra context, additional information, and that extra context, as mentioned, can be added by adding a role, which makes sense for some but not all prompts, and by adding extra constraints or information, which makes sense for a lot of prompts. So context is important, and you learned that you can add context by adding roles and constraints or extra information. Using this basic strategy and keeping those core elements that make up prompts in mind will often lead to great results. But no matter how good the results are, the initial result, the first result you get from ChatGPT, might not be exactly what you're looking for. For example, here in this tweet, we might be happy with the start of the tweet, but maybe I then don't want to have this "let's embrace the trails and breathe the magic of the great outdoors" part in there. Maybe I instead want to add a personal note, a personal touch to this tweet, and maybe I also want to encourage my target audience, the people who read the tweet, to share what they think about hiking. And whilst you still might want to change some parts of that final response, which, by the way, is something I absolutely would recommend, because ChatGPT can be a great starting point, but you should always take a critical look at the results it gives you and fine-tune them as needed for your specific use case. But whilst you can do all of that, using follow-up messages and taking advantage of the fact that you're dealing with a chat, where ChatGPT will take all messages into account, not just your latest message, can lead to better results and therefore better starting points for your finishing touches. And since ChatGPT takes the entire chat history into account and not just your latest message, which is really important, you don't have to put as much information into your follow-up message. Instead, this can simply be a simpler message where you don't set a role or anything like that, but where you just define the extra goal or change that should be applied by ChatGPT, and ChatGPT will automatically look at the existing history and put your new message into context to that existing history. So it will connect the new message with that existing history. And that's, of course, a super powerful feature which allows you to use ChatGPT in a highly efficient way. Therefore, you also don't have to get that initial prompt 100% right. You don't have to come up with the perfect initial prompt. Instead, you can refine the response and the result over time by sending follow-up messages. And that is absolutely something you should be aware of because it is a key ChatGPT feature. It's called ChatGPT after all, and not one message GPT or something like this. So when working with ChatGPT and when constructing prompts, context is really important. But which kind of context, which kind of information should you add to your prompts? Well, in the end, of course, any information that's important for your goal, for the main purpose of your prompt, but whichever context you are adding, and I'll dive into some more concrete examples in just a second, whichever context you are adding, you should prefer short, focused sentences. For some prompts, you can also just use a list of keywords, like a bullet list or anything like that, and that might give you good results, but in general, right now, it seems as if short sentences that contain the relevant data are better than simple lists of keywords. Now, that being said, though, of course, you should include all the important keywords that you need for your prompt, just not as a list of keywords, but instead enclosed into short, focused sentences. You should definitely avoid adding unnecessary information to your prompts, though. Anything that's not needed to achieve your goal could distract ChatGPT and could therefore lead to a suboptimal result. Now, besides adding some general keywords and goal-specific information, there are some types of information that are needed for almost all prompts. For example, for many prompts, you might want to define the target audience of the prompt. If you're asking ChatGPT to create a tweet for you, you might want to specify who's the target audience of that tweet, since that, of course, helps ChatGPT fine-tune the tweet towards that target audience. You also might want to control the tone, style, and length of the output. If it should be friendly or very determined, if it should be a very long response or pretty short. You can also define how many characters you want to have in that result output, for example. And speaking of that output, another important kind of context you might want to add to some prompts is the output format. Now, the default is that you get text, and for many use cases, that's exactly what you need. But you can use ChatGPT for all kinds of scenarios, for example, also to generate some dummy data that you might want to use in one of your projects. For example, if you're developing an application or if you're practicing data science. And in such scenarios, it could be helpful to tell ChatGPT that you want the output in JSON format, or in CSV format, or that you want unformatted markdown, so raw markdown format, which you then could feed into your application where it then might get formatted. So it's really important to also be aware of this fact, that you can control the output format. So learning about the importance of context and giving you some ideas of context you might want to add to your prompts, always depending on the goal you're trying to achieve, of course, though, is important, but it's only practice that makes perfect. And therefore, I prepared a couple of examples which you can use to practice what you learned over the last lectures. And of course, in the next lecture, I will also show you how I would approach those examples and how I would try to create prompts that give me the best possible result for those examples. Now you see the examples here, and my challenge for you is to take these examples and try to create your own prompts, which you then feed into ChatGPT. And definitely try out different prompts and try refining the result with follow-up chat messages. As mentioned in the next lecture, I will show you how I would approach these tasks, but of course it's very important to keep in mind that we're dealing with a dynamic system here. So of course, even if you take exactly the same prompts as I'm using, you're likely to not get exactly the same output, and you might even come up with a prompt that produces a better output than my prompts do. So definitely take this as a chance to practice what you learned, play around with different prompt styles and different pieces of context that you add to those prompts, and then take a look at my example solutions in the next lecture.